Welcome back to Sociology 226. This is Michel Foucault, Video 1. In this video, I've got 3 goals. First, I want to give you a general overview of Foucault's life and work. Next, I want to look to 2 of his major influences, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and the French philosopher Louis Althusser. Finally, I want to give you a general sketch of the readings before you go and do them. Let's do it. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher and historian. While Foucault is certainly not a sociologist, based both on training and for other reasons I will explain later on, his impact on the social sciences is significant, and his concepts have deeply shaped the way that people in this department work. Foucault deeply shaped how we think about surveillance, about crime, about the body, and about power. My job is to give a meat and potatoes explanation of Foucault's work. You're going to need it, as you'll hear a lot more about him as you continue on at Queen's. On Foucault's personal life, we don't know a lot. He kept his personal history very guarded. We know he was born to an upper middle class family in 1926, his father a doctor. Foucault was openly gay and was one of the first major intellectuals to die of AIDS, as was later revealed. He was not, for reasons you shall see, very interested in identity politics, however. Let's look to Foucault's career. Foucault was a very public intellectual. He gave a lot of interviews, which are a great way to get into his work in plain English. Well, French translated. His job at the Collège de France was to give 13 lectures a year on the work he was doing as he was doing it, which are still being translated and published. We have not only a bunch of books that Foucault was working on, but also his public interviews and detailed lectures as his thought evolved. We don't have this from, say, Marx, but only because he couldn't get a job. While Foucault's life was very private, his thinking was not. On to Foucault's main interests. Throughout Foucault's work, we find 3 themes, as you see on the slide. I'll discuss each in detail. First and foremost, Foucault is interested in relationships of power. He's interested in the different ways that power comes to shape the taken-for-granted institutions that make up our everyday lives. He's interested in the power relationships that make up different human categories, and how we incorporate those power relationships in our self-understanding. So, and this is crucial, he doesn't just see power as repressive, something restricting action, but as something productive, as enabling. Secondly, Foucault is interested in truth, the historical ways that we come to accept particular truths versus others. In The History of Madness, for example, he charts how different ways of knowing madness emerge over time, from the age of confinement, as he calls it, to our contemporary world of mental illness. Here he's interested in how we come to accept particular truths in particular conditions. The same is the case of the changes in the way that we think about our sexuality. Finally, at least for this list, Foucault is interested in subjectivity. Recall, I said that there are 3 ways to think about subjectivity. In the grammatical sense, the king is bald; the political sense, the king is in charge; and in the philosophical sense, I believe we have the grounds to say the king is balding. Foucault is interested in the way we talk about subjects as particular kinds of people. He's interested in the philosophy of the subject and how that has changed over time. And he's interested in the management of subjects, as you'll see in the readings this week. Foucault, as we shall see in the next video, is interested in how we generate new kinds of subjectivity throughout history, how that relates to power, and ways of knowing. How do we know ourselves in different ways over time? This is a key Foucauldian question. Finally, let's look to the themes of Foucault's books. Like Marx, I think we can divide Foucault's work into 3 broad stages. First, he was interested in psychiatry, medicine, and the history of the social sciences, each producing different and yet overlapping ways of knowing the person throughout history. His work, The History of Madness, abridged translation, Madness and Civilization, represents this early period. In his middle stage, for lack of a better term, he turns to political questions about the history of government over time and the changing nature of power in society. Here he asks how sovereign power, the power of the right of kings, becomes more diffuse and distributed throughout societies. He's still interested in questions about knowledge, but now emphasizes its relationship to politics. The chapter you'll read today, Docile Bodies, is from Discipline and Punish, representing this period. Here he's asking about how bodies become political in new mechanisms of training and discipline. Finally, Foucault became interested in sexuality towards the end of his life. He intended to produce a 6-volume series on the history of sexuality, managing only to write 3, and leave notes for a 4th volume that just came out. Here, Foucault was interested in the various historical truths about sexuality and how we come to incorporate those truths into our self-understanding. Here the interest isn't in sexual activity per se, but rather in the ways that sex is made a problem throughout history, and the answers that we come up with to that problem. So throughout his work, we see 3 intertwining themes of power, truth, and subjectivity come up. At each stage, broadly, he's interested in the institutional landscape where we come to know truths about human life and how that knowledge shapes who we are. Let's look to Foucault's influences. The first, Friedrich Nietzsche. The biggest philosophical influence on Foucault was the German philosopher and philologist Friedrich Nietzsche, philology being the comparative study of languages. Now you know. Here, we are interested in Nietzsche's philosophy of morality. Nietzsche called his overall project the revaluation of all values. That is, he was interested in exploring the moral trends from ancient Greek and Roman cultures to modern Christian cultures and how we come to our present day. He believed that the contemporary moral order denies the potential for excellence as it is promoted through Christian cultural norms. From this, Foucault takes his fundamentally historical method, Nietzsche's genealogy. Foucault also draws from Nietzsche in his understanding of truth. Throughout Nietzsche's philosophy, it is a fundamental belief that the world is far less ordered and reasonable than most philosophers have thought. The world is fundamentally chaotic, and we try to shape it in our own image. We force order on the world as we force order on each other, and others force back. The focus isn't just on knowledge, but on energies and overcoming. We can call this Nietzsche's anti-rationality, because he doesn't see the world in terms of a divinely ordered plan, or a fundamentally reasonable thing. Life and knowledge, for Nietzsche, are constant struggles. Finally, Nietzsche casts our individual minds and bodies as parts of this overall struggle. Each body strives to increase its power of action, as does each mind. He calls this the will to power, first and beyond good and evil. What we call good and evil are just those things that prevent us from reaching our goals. Here, Nietzsche opposes Christian morality, what he calls herd morality, because it fools us into believing that salvation in another world is worth denying this one. He wants to maximize our drives, our bodily capacity for action, something Christian morality opposes. This interest on the body and bodily morality is deeply influential on Foucault. So think morality, power, truth. That's Nietzsche. Next, on to Althusser. In an earlier video, I explored how Marx and Engels theorize ideology. Remember the opening lines of the German ideology. Hitherto, men have always formed wrong ideas about themselves, about what they are, and what they ought to be. Marx and Engels argue that the way we come to know and understand things is ultimately determined by our material existence, that sensuous life activity is formed by the ways that we labor. Labor doesn't alienate our consciousness, it shapes it. This we call the base superstructure argument. Althusser, similarly, was thinking about the different ways that we consciously and unconsciously accept the dominant order of material relations. When walking down the street, someone calls out, "Hey you," and you turn around. "It's me!" Well, in the same fashion we come to identify with our place in the dominant order of material relations, clinging to it as we would any other part of our identity. This is Louis Althusser's extension of Marx and Engels' concept of ideology. Hailing. The police hail us and we are ready to respond. Your boss calls, you answer. The school teacher hails us and we turn around and do what we're told. The sociology professor hails us, you get the idea. This is a bad summary of Althusser's ideology and ideological state apparatuses, a real pleasure to read. I'm being honest, should you care to. This is where Foucault takes his understanding of subject formation. We can use an historical method inspired by Nietzsche and trace how institutions shape life. Althusser's interest was on how these institutions, state, public, and private, reproduce dominant material relations, how they reproduce capital. Foucault's interest is in how they shape truth and how we come to understand ourselves while we do so. Althusser is interested in how we remain subjects of capital. Foucault interested in subjects of knowledge and power. In both cases, we are often willing participants. This can include capital and economic relationships, but its scope is much broader to include social sciences, psychology, sexuality. Similar structure, different scope. We'll return to Foucault's relationship to Marx later, as there are some really important differences. As an example of all this, I'm walking down Princess Street with a friend, and one of you guys last year said, "Hello, Dr. Abrams. I was hailed as your professor." My friend Stephanie said to me, "Oh man, does that happen to you all the time?" And I said, "Well, yes, reasonably often." In this situation, I'm hailed as the professor for your class, and I have to respond as such. I hate getting called Dr. Abrams because it always means I have to give someone an extension or a letter of reference. Think of your mom calling you by your entire first, middle, and last name. You gotta do stuff. Same thing. What Althusser's point is that not only do we participate in capitalist economies, but we also identify and incorporate capitalist subjectivities into our lives. It isn't just an illusion, but we actively accept and reproduce capital by acting within ideology. Foucault is interested in how human categories are distributed and how we have come to accept ourselves as such. This project combines Nietzsche and Althusser. If you Google Althusser, you'll see that his life had some regrettable moments. We're not saying he was a good guy. We're just saying he was important for French thought in the 20th century. Now, on to the readings. Now, you will read a chapter of Foucault's famous book, Discipline and Punish. Do it! When doing so, I'd like you to think about three things. Power. This is a book about power. Not just power making us do stuff, but also on the relationship between power and knowledge, and how this relationship has changed over time. Foucault is exploring how power has shifted as we approach the modern age, and how scientific knowledge on prisons, on factories, on soldiers has shifted. The body. This is also a book about bodies. How have they been acted on and made to act throughout history? When you go through the readings, keep thinking about how bodies are being managed and managed differently. History. Finally, think about the method that Michel Foucault is using to make his argument about power, about the body, and about knowledge. What kind of sources does he use, and when are they from? Foucault is going to argue that we can do a history of knowledge and power in the same way as you can do a family history. This is going to be a tough read, but I promise you, it's worth it. And if it wasn't difficult, it wouldn't be worth doing.